Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. This week we are going to be talking about the golden age of Mexican cinema, basically around World War II into the mid-1950s. What are the conventions of the golden age of Mexican cinema? In other words, what is it? Well, let's look at when it first began and why. It began during World War II when Mexico becomes a center for film production for national and international markets. The golden age of Mexican cinema is characterized by a Hollywood tradition of what we call the star system, in which stars are a primary marketing device and attraction. So you might recognize some of the great Mexican actors of this period, like Maria Felix, Pedro Infante, Mario Moreno, otherwise more famously known as Cantinflas, Dolores del Rio, who also stars in Maria Candelaria, this week's film, Pedro Armendáriz, who also co-stars with Dolores del Rio, and Jorge Negrete. The films coming out of Mexico at this time had high production values. In other words, there was a high technical quality of the film stock, the lighting, the sets, the wardrobe. The quality of the direction and the cinematography, as well as the acting, was quite high, and it competed with Hollywood in many ways within Mexico and within Latin America. Mexico was second only to the United States in terms of distribution of films. So you can imagine Mexican films at this time were competing head to head with the great American Hollywood films of the time in the American Golden Age. In these films, there always appeared an individual who embodied the state, an authority figure. It was their job to, quote, mediate between the decent poor and the noble rich. This person was frequently a police officer, a doctor, a teacher. And in our film, that role is occupied by a priest, a hapless priest, an ethically dubious painter who sets the story's chain of events in motion, and a doctor. In other words, this character represented the established order, the way things were, and reinforced that established order. During this time, the dominant genres were dramas, comedies, and comedias rancheras. But really, it was the drama or the melodrama, which are stories characterized by an excess of feelings. Very dramatic, designed to get the audience to cry, to feel emotion. And frequently these worked. I wonder whether you won't be moved by the film that we're going to watch this week, even though it is a melodrama, or precisely because of that. The acting is a little bit over the top, a little bit sort of like a soap opera or a telenovela, but it also still pulls at your heartstrings, and that's what these films were designed to do. The performances were indeed overly stylized and not very natural. They were non-naturalistic performances. Other films included thrillers and films that tackled social problems, like Los Olvidados, which tackled the problem of juvenile delinquency. Other films tackled other social issues, like prostitution, alcoholism, racism, and migration. There was a group of filmmakers led and composed by Agustin Fink, who was a great producer of the time, in what was called La Escuela Mexicana del Cine, the Mexican School of Cinema. He composed a team which comprised of director Emilio Fernandez, otherwise known as El Indio, as well as the great cinematographer, perhaps the best Mexican cinematographer of all time, Gabriel Figueroa. There was also a film editor and a screenwriter who also composed part of this group. This group of filmmakers were characterized by a synthesis of two primary elements: influence from Hollywood, and specifically the Hollywood melodrama, as well as something very distinctly Mexican, Mexican muralism, which we'll talk about in a moment. This school of cinema was influenced by Sergei Eisenstein's Que Viva Mexico, which was a film made by a Russian director, one of the great montage theorists, who came to Mexico and filmed a lot of film, but didn't finish it. People who knew him at the time kind of put the movie together in their own way, and you can watch different versions of it. But it had a tremendous amount of influence in the way it filmed the indigenous people, the traditions of Mexico in the 1930s and the late 1920s. Finally, there was more influence from Hollywood. One was in the pacing of the films, which emulated John Ford, for example, in his film Stagecoach. And it also was influenced by Hollywood in terms of lighting in the cinematography, a specific type of lighting which almost had a noir feel to it. It's a kind of lighting known as chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word which means light and shadow. In addition, there was a kind of cinematography known as deep focus. Deep focus means the ability to see well into the picture and having everything from the foreground through to the background be in focus. The primary influencer here was the American cinematographer Gregg Toland. So let's tackle these one by one. First, Mexican muralism. Here we have part of a Mexican mural by Diego Rivera. Here we have one by José Clemente Orozco. And finally, we have one by David Alfaro Siqueiros. These are the three great Mexican artists of the early and mid-20th century. Let's back up and take a look at them again. Diego Rivera, of course. You can see here the composition is very powerful, the colors are very vibrant, and he deals with social issues. But then again, so does Clemente Orozco. Here he deals with Pancho Villa, and you can see here, Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. And here you can see the Mexican Revolution. You can see the composition is very, very clear. Striking composition. As well as Siqueiros. This is a self-portrait of Siqueiros. And here we have deep focus. We can see Siqueiros' face, but we can also see the tips of his fingers, and the image recedes back in space. Incredibly powerful. Here's an image with Figueroa, one of the great cinematographers of the period that we're talking about, Gabriel Figueroa, with two of the great muralists. So here we're going to look at the stylistic influence of the Mexican muralists on La Escuela Mexicana de Cine. We have Figueroa center with muralists Diego Rivera left and David Alfaro Siqueiros. Rivera influenced Figueroa's idea of color and composition, while Siqueiros' theories of escorzo, or foreshortening, formed the basis for the almost 3D images and deep focus characteristic of the cinematographer's work. So we can see here, Siqueiros is using foreshortening, so he's kind of squeezing into a flat surface a three-dimensional image which recedes, as I mentioned earlier. And here, Figueroa borrows composition, themes, color. Eventually, he will work in color from Rivera. And here, from Orozco, you'll notice in our film this week, pay attention to the scene. See if you can remember this when you watch it. It's the scene with the torches. That's all I'm going to say because I don't want to give away any spoilers. But in the scene with the torches, you'll notice that they line up in a very similar way as these soldiers. So one major influence was Mexican art. Next, Hollywood. Hollywood had a tremendous influence on La Escuela Mexicana. But what was so amazing about the way Figueroa and the directors of the time absorbed Hollywood was they made it Mexican. They took these ideas, but they appropriated them in the coolest way possible. One of the ways they did it was through chiaroscuro, which is, again, dramatic lighting and shadows, extreme contrasts of light and dark. So watch for this in Maria Candelaria. An excellent example of this is here in Citizen Kane, a great American film with the cinematography by Greg Toland, directed by Orson Welles. Here we can see the dramatic use of high contrast, dark shadow, and bright light in the shot. That is emulated in our film as well. Pay attention to the prison scene in particular. When we get to the prison scene, notice the dramatic contrast of bright areas and dark, dark shadows. So watch for this in our film Maria Candelaria. Next, the Mexican School of Cinema also dramatically borrowed and dramatically used the alternation of slow scenes to indicate calm, immediately contrasted with dramatic fast scenes to indicate violence and crime. Watch for this as well when there is crime that is occurring in our film. But they also borrowed the ability to alternate dramatically quiet scenes with the sudden use of a musical score to heighten action and tension. In other words, quiet, slow scene. And then suddenly the music comes in and a dramatic change happens. That was directly borrowed from John Ford in a number of his films, primarily Stagecoach in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Also, crucially, similar to Hollywood, these films philosophically adopted themes and stories in which everyone occupies a socially prescribed place. Everyone has their place in this culture, in the society. And these are stories that accept the status quo of the established order. They don't challenge it. Unlike the films of Luis Buñuel, the Mexican films of Luis Buñuel, which, like Los Olvidados, challenged or at least revealed the weakness and hypocrisy of that order. So Luis Buñuel was a real standout. And although his Mexican films were actually part of this Época de Oro, or golden age of Mexican film, Buñuel's films were not typical or representative of it. So this film that we're going to watch this week is a direct contrast in which Emilio Fernández directs a film which perfectly embodies La Escuela Mexicana and the Época de Oro, right? The Mexican school of cinema and this golden age of Mexican film in which there's melodrama and they don't challenge the established order. On both counts, Buñuel's films are not melodramatic. They're dry, as I mentioned in my lecture last week. And they do challenge, or at least reveal, the corruption of the status quo. In other words, they reveal child delinquency. They reveal child and juvenile neglect. They reveal the dark underbelly of Mexican society, which Mexican society, as I mentioned last week, did not like. It wasn't until his film also won at Cannes that he was embraced by the Mexican film industry. We can see here in Gabriel Figueroa's cinematography, deep focus from our film, the film we're going to watch this week. And you can see here how the flowers in the foreground are perfectly crisp. And in the background, they're not perfectly crisp, but we can clearly make them out. In this area here, you'll notice it is in focus. Look at how in focus the deep background is. So this was a technique that was borrowed and then adopted and embraced and appropriated by the Mexican film industry. Let's move on and talk specifically about Maria Candelaria, in which the great Mexican actress Dolores del Rio plays the title character. The film was also known as in other words, or Xochimilco, which is where it's set. So the technical name of the film is Maria Candelaria o Xochimilco, with Pedro Armendáriz, who plays Maria's fiancé, and among other actors, one actor which we'll visit in just a moment, named Manuel Inclán, who also 6 years later would appear in Los Olvidados. This advertisement or poster says, Dolores del Rio, Dolores, I guess that's misspelled, portrays a flower girl determined to marry her only love in Maria Candelaria. So let's just pause for a moment and just tell you, that's what this story is really about a poor, rejected native Mexican woman, an indigenous Mexican woman, even though she's not played by an indigenous actor. She represents an indigenous woman, which we'll talk about. And she wants to marry her fiancé, but they can't afford to get married. And she tries to fight off the discrimination against her by the town and marry her boyfriend. The film was directed by Emilio Fernandez. This film called world attention to the Mexican cinema and established Fernandez as the single most important movie director of the 1940s. Fantastic. All right, so let's take a look at this film specifically and how it represents the Época de Oro, the Golden Age, as well as the ideas of Emilio Fernandez, the director, about Mexicanidad, what it means to be Mexicano, Mexican. Luis Duno Gottberg says that in 1943, Emilio Fernandez directed his greatest work, Maria Candelaria, which won him many awards, prestige, and status as one of the greatest filmmakers in Mexican history. This film presented the spirit of the Mexican national identity and captivated audience. As we quickly move through this lecture, we will discuss the question of Mexican national identity. How does this film do that? Let's explore. The film was directed by Emilio Fernandez, and Maria Candelaria was the first Mexican film to ever be presented in France at the very prestigious Cannes Film Festival. It won 2 prizes. First, it won for Best Picture, which is the Grand Prix Award at the time, today also known as the Palme d'Or, and it also won for Best Cinematography in 1936. So 2 years after it was released in the United States, 3 years after it was released in Mexico. And that achievement single-handedly put Mexican film and the film industry on the map globally. It drew international attention and acclaim. What about the story? So the story here is set in Xochimilco, in the Chinampas de Xochimilco, in the floating gardens of Xochimilco, where flowers, sunflower seeds, amapolas, which are poppy seeds and poppy flowers, are grown in the south of Mexico City. It still exists today. It's a major, major tourist attraction, and it's really quite beautiful. And there are still these canals and rivers and lakes which you can navigate with these boats. The film, even though it was shot in 1942 and 1943, is actually set in 1909. Remember this term. The term is a period film. A period film means a film that was set in the past. So even though it was filmed in 1943, it was set 30 years earlier. Just before, the time it was set right before the Mexican Revolution, which actually lasted for about 10 years from 1910 to 1920. The Mexican Revolution was a series of conflicts and social unrest that ended effectively a 30-year dictatorship by Porfirio Diaz and replaced it with a constitutional republic in 1917. But it wasn't until the conflict began to ebb in 1920 and eventually the revolution was consolidated under President Lázaro Cárdenas in 1934. So it took a long time before there was social stability and the government was able to maintain control over vast parts of the country and quell the counter-rebellion. Why was it set in 1909? That's an interesting question. Perhaps the film was set at this time to suggest that this type of story would not be possible when the film was made in 1943. In other words, the story that occurred was like an old story. This is not something that represents Mexico now, but it represents Mexico's roots It's a story set in the past. Why? Presumably because the discrimination against Maria Candelaria for being poor, for being the daughter of a prostitute, no, that's not possible in 1943, is the suggestion. But she represents a Mexican past in which that kind of discrimination was possible, yet she was also venerated for her martyrdom in a way, right? For her sacrifice. Let's explore this. So here she is. This is Dolores del Rio, who plays Maria Candelaria. And Pedro Armendáriz here is playing Lorenzo Rafael, her fiancé. They look noble. You can see the image here is filmed tilted up, so we are below their eye line. We're looking up at them. Notice how many shots in this film are actually filmed below the eye line, looking up, almost venerating them, looking up to these characters, idealizing them, almost idolizing them. You can also see here the quality of the image. Look how beautiful the film stock is. Now, unfortunately, it's hard to find films from this time period that have actually been reworked and improved and remastered to restore their original beauty. I found a copy which is the best I could find. There were definitely worse copies. And I found a copy to which I attached English subtitles. But if anybody has any films from the Época de Oro that are high quality, please share them with me or just send me an email. Let me know if you have any Blu-rays or DVDs, because I've tried to find some and I was unable to find high quality, especially Blu-ray copies. So we'll have to get through this week with a less than pristine copy, but I just want to show you, don't forget that the images that you're going to see are somewhat degraded from the original beauty. It is a pity that these films are not in their pristine, ideal conditions. Let's talk about the story here. The film idealizes, as I mentioned, Maria Candelaria. She is an indígena. Again, she is a daughter of a prostitute whose mother has died. She lives alone. She is an outcast. Nobody wants to talk to her. They won't let her sell her flowers in the tianguis, the marketplace. And yet she was able to attract the Pedro Armendáriz character, Lorenzo Rafael, and catch his heart. Someone else, Lupe, is in love with him. And another man is in love with Maria Candelaria. So each of them has two pretendientes, or suitors, who want their attention. And those two suitors are going to cause all the trouble in the story. Ironically, the character of Maria Candelaria is played by Dolores del Rio, who is a great Mexican film star, but she has pronounced European features. She's very light-skinned. Further, she is rejected by the village people around her, but they, weirdly, are played by actual indigenous people. So you have a character who's supposed to be indigenous, who's played by a European-style actor, and the people who discriminate against her are actual indígena, gente indígena, indigenous people. The story of Maria Candelaria is actually begun and ended as a narrative or story within a story, a narrative within a narrative. And it's told by El Pintor, who played by the actor Alberto Galvan. So he's a portraitist who tells the story of how he ended up painting Maria Candelaria's portrait, which sets in progress a chain of events that will lead to a certain outcome, which I won't reveal. This character, El Pintor, sets up a mystery, creating suspense about what happened to Maria Candelaria. Part of the story, this is important for you to know, but you'll figure it out too, involves a medication called quinine, or quinine, which was used to prevent and treat malaria. So even though we don't hear the term malaria throughout the whole story, we just hear of fever and illness, it's important to know that this was a medication that was used at the time. Paul Schroeder Rodriguez says the following: the atavism of the indigenous community, atavism means primitive behavior. So the atavism of the indigenous community contrasts sharply with the modern outlook of the white Criollo characters. Criollo means basically white, or of pure Spanish descent, not mixed with the natives. The priest, the painter, and the medical doctor. So we have two camps. We have two distinct social groups. We have the indigenous community who reject Maria Candelaria, and the priest, the painter, and the doctor who support her, at least nominally or supposedly. As you watch, I want you to ask yourself or think about, how are the modern white characters portrayed? What are their characteristics? How are the indigenous people portrayed? Now, this is a film that in its own mind, Emilio Fernandez wanted to venerate the indigenous community. But does he succeed? He wanted to venerate Maria Candelaria as an example of a pure Mexican soul. But does he succeed? Who actually protects Maria Candelaria and who persecutes her? So the intentions of the film are not necessarily the outcome that we expect. In other words, it's trying to do something, but does it succeed? You can clearly see that I'm suggesting that it doesn't. And that's a common consensus among scholars of this film and of this time period. In between the indigenous community and the white community, or the characters, is one character. His name is Don Damian, and he's played by the actor Miguel Inclán. He is a mestizo, a mixed race Mexican, part white Criollo and part indigenous. He is the villain of the story. Let's see if we recognize him. This is him in Maria Candelaria. He plays a villain. He's actually in love with, or in lust with, Maria Candelaria, and tries to get vengeance on her because she has a boyfriend, not him. What's fascinating is that 6 years later, he appears in Los Olvidados as the blind musician beggar named Don Carmelo. And it's just a wonderful, both performances are absolutely amazing. What a great actor. And see if you can notice, you'll quickly remember his voice and his gestures. He's just a great actor. So that's a nice little sense of continuity among actors of this period. So when we go back to Luis Duno Gottberg's statement, which we already looked at, that this film presented the spirit of the Mexican national identity, how does it do that? How does it do that? If we have three different castes, three different social groups, criollos, mestizos, and indígenas, white, mixed, and native, what is the argument that it's making? Well, let's take a closer look. According to Luis Duno Gottberg, the same academic, he says, there is a negative association with the indigenous, even though this film is supposed to represent the culture and history of the indigenous population. So it's trying to present an image that is positive, but it fails. And beyond that, even though the audience is supposed to take Maria's side, the representation of her is still problematic in that her authority is robbed and she is reduced to labels in her community. In other words, her character is powerless. She doesn't have agency. She doesn't have self-determination. And even though the film is trying to build her up as a saintly, sanctified character, the argument here is that it doesn't succeed. See if you agree with that. Also, see if you agree if the story is moving. Does the story tug at your heartstrings? Or is it a little too melodramatic? You let me know in our discussion board when you get to that point. So just to close out our discussion here today, according to Jill Nelmes, who wrote a book called Introduction to Film Studies. Here's what she says about this film. The principal exponent is basically someone who carries out an action, right? So the principal kind of, quote, actor or director of the resulting iconic cinema was the director Emilio El Indio Fernández, whose work with the renowned cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa achieved international recognition in the 1940s. Hirschfeld and Maciel describe how Fernández elevated, quote, elevated the Indians to mythic stature. Think about that. He's trying, now his name, his apodo or nickname was El Indio, because his mother was full-blooded indígena, native. So he identified powerfully with the indigenous culture. So according to Hirschfeld and Maciel, he elevated the native indigenous culture to a mythic stature and romanticized their lives, and linked the meaning of lo mexicano, the Mexicanness, visually and narratively to Mexico's indigenous roots. In other words, according to these academics, Hirschfeld and Maciel, what it means to be Mexican is partly indigenous. So it's not a rejection of Mexicans are mixed or Mexicans are more towards white. No, it elevates them. In melodramas such as Flor Silvestre, Wildflower, and Maria Candelaria, both from 1943, and Enamorada, 1946, the giant stars of Mexican cinema, Dolores del Rio, Maria Felix, and Pedro Armendáriz, brought a whole new image of Mexico to the big screen. Here's the rub. A curious element of these films, highlighting a certain equivocation. Equivocation means the use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth or prevaricate, in other words, lie, was in the casting of these light-skinned, European-looking women in the roles of indigenous characters. Nevertheless, however, these films have deservedly become the archetype of earlier Mexican cinema. So, let's break that down. On the one hand, we have a director who is idealizing a downtrodden, unfortunate indigenous woman and venerating her, putting her on a pedestal. And he makes the equivalent, see if you notice this, how many times he draws a parallel between La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, and Maria Candelaria. On the other hand, the people who actually persecute her the most are her own indigenous people, as well as the singular mestizo mixed character, Don Damian, played by Miguel Inclán. While within the film, the people who supposedly are trying to help her are all the white criollos. So it's very, very odd here. The film seems to validate the current social structure, with the white criollos at the top, the mixed race mestizos in the middle, and the indigenous people at the bottom. But it also takes the most bottom of the bottom, the most rejected indigenous woman, and puts her at the top and says she is pure of heart like the Virgin. How do we make sense of this? How do we protect the social structure, this kind of stratified attitude towards keeping the indigenous people down at the bottom of the social structure and painting them as primitive and backwards, as you'll see, and yet taking the lowest of the low and turning her into a status of an icon in Mexican iconography, La Virgen. So I want you to think about this as you watch the film. I want you to keep in mind, yes, you can enjoy the story. It is quite beautiful in many ways. It's very melodramatic and it will pull at your heartstrings. But at the same time, ask yourself, is this a film that goes along with discrimination or does it go against it? If so, how? That's what I want you to think about as you watch the film. So enjoy the film. Then I want you to read an article about Gabriel Figueroa from the American Cinematographer magazine, in which they really spend a lot of time and effort to show what a great cinematographer he was. And move on to the discussion board as well as the quiz. All right, have a great week, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module, as well as reading your discussion board posts. Bye-bye.